Hello, everyone. So we are picking up the story of the Flavian dynasty in lecture 3 of lesson 34. And I want to begin this section by talking about the end of Vespasian's rule. And I think overall, Vespasian went down in Roman history as a very solid, reliable ruler who brought with him some very Italian values of sort of hard work, military conquest, a certain sense of what that is like in terms of being Roman. And I think some of the sayings of his that we have already observed suggested that he was having this sort of very down-to-earth character as well. So we already have seen that when he had a long day at the triumph, he commented on that. And in 79, supposedly, as he was dying, he said, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." And this is preserved for us in Suetonius's life of Vespasian, along a number of other sayings. But as always in Suetonius, these famous last words sort of are supposed to describe someone's character. And in this case, it suggests that Vespasian was potentially aware both of how likely it was that his sons would inherit his rule, so the success of his dynastic plans, but also that maybe he was a little bit skeptical about some of the processes that were to follow, which included him, in fact, becoming a divine figure, becoming a god. This process was further enhanced by the fact that he actually started to build a forum for himself, the Forum of Vespasian. And although this is one of those fora that we know rather little of, it appears that it had a temple on it that was a temple of peace. And so one could sort of summarize Vespasian's rule as following in Augustus's footsteps in terms of trying to balance a message of military success, so a message of war, with a message of peace and sort of pacifying the provinces and sort of the good life that comes from that. And so upon the death of Vespasian, his older son Titus, the one who conquered Jerusalem and the one who celebrated the triumph with him, the one whom he fully endorsed as his heir, he had the particular package of powers that implied that he was going to step into his father's shoes as emperor. And in fact, in 79, Titus took over. And I think one of the things about Titus that is sort of interesting to observe is that his rule is incredibly short, and he is very much liked by many of our sources. And it sort of suggests that, if you only have 2 years to rule, maybe it's really hard to mess it up. But I think it is possible to mess it up even in 2 years. And it seems instead that Titus followed very nicely in his father's footsteps. As we mentioned earlier, it was under his rule that the Colosseum was finally opened. And in addition to that, it was part of a larger building structure. So if your back is just against the Colosseum and you are going to the main Roman Forum today, you would be walking down this road that would lead to a new triumphal arch that was offered under in the year 80 as well, the Arch of Titus. And I think triumphal arches are always very significant for representing military success. And in this case, Titus's message is in a continuation of how we have been thinking about the Colosseum as also celebrating the victory over the Jews. And so what I want you to do the next time you are in Rome, and I really hope we will all be in Rome at some point soon, is that when you walk up here, try to go under in the middle of the triumphal arch. There are some chains there, but I'm optimistic you can get under there, and you can just tell them that your professoressa, in Italian professor, told you to go under there. And what you will see on the two sides of the arch as you're walking under there is one side you will see the emperor Titus himself in triumphal procession. And so this is again that image of victory that we have been observing now for quite some time. On the other side, rather interestingly, you see further parts of the triumphal procession going under a triumphal arch. And in that procession, we see the spoils of victory from Jerusalem being brought to Rome. And it's just a really impressive image of of sort of how that military success was something that the whole dynasty fully embraced. And so Titus himself wanted to continue with that message as part of the legitimacy of Flavian rule. Shortly thereafter, we have this celebration, or in fact, actually, even before we finish Titus's role, the other famous event that happened is something you already know an awful lot about, and that is that in August of 79, soon after, about 2 months after Vespasian died, was the eruption of the Vesuvius that led to the destruction of Pompeii, which is what you watched the documentary about last week. And that was something, you know, that Titus's rather short rule also was famous for. We don't know exactly how Titus died. People have rumored in the ancient world already that maybe it was his younger brother Domitian who wanted him dead, so he had a chance to rule himself. At any rate, upon Titus's death, Domitian in fact took over, and I think Domitian, somewhat similarly to Nero, went down in Roman history as a famous bad emperor. And it's one of those cases where, again, we can question a little bit, you know, I urge you also to read Mary Beard on this, is sort of what does it mean when we have such an emperor who is a bad emperor? To what extent does that shape the lives of his subjects? And so in the case of Domitian, some things we know about that were supposedly sort of definitely marks of at least a solid administrator. Whether one loves a solid administrator or not, I leave that to you, is that early in his rule, he was able to push through some financial reforms. And what we usually see in financial reforms is that what emperors do is that they take the silver denarius and they essentially make it usually smaller, thereby having less silver value in the coinage. And what we see under Domitian, that he actually makes it contain more silver, right? So it's almost like he is increasing the value of the Roman coin by putting more silver into it. In this case, he was also putting an image on there. He had a child that then passed away. This image is supposed to represent how he is becoming a god. So maybe there's a complex message there, but nevertheless, it seems that quite a bit of that sort of financial administration of the Roman Empire was in quite a good shape under the Flavian emperors and definitely under Domitian. Another area where he was reasonably successful, or at least not majorly unsuccessful, was in military conquest. There were some early problems in Britain, but more importantly, this is a period where we see a slow shift, and this is important to understand in terms of how the history of the Roman Empire will unfold, is that ever since Augustus, we have been observing problems with the Germans right here in this part of the Roman Empire. And in fact, in 83, there were some successes of Domitian against this particular group here in sort of brown, the Chatti, and he was able to increase legionary pay. So this part of his administration was quite successful, even though some people thought that maybe this was not something, again, that the Romans could fully hold on to. Another area of conflict, and this is now the interesting sort of geographical development from the 1st to the 2nd century, is a slow movement of conflict from this part, from the German area, down to this part. And so if you have sort of interest in this, this is the river Danube now. So we're moving from the Rhine over to the Danube. And Professor Varhey was born somewhere close to the area where the Danube turns there. So that's an interesting factoid you may or may not be able ever use. But this area further to the east, which is modern-day Romania, not Hungary, is the area of Dacia, which is becoming a new source of conflict at this time and marks this shift further to the east as an area of conflict in the 2nd century. And so it is under Domitian that we find some wars here. And in particular, I mean, in terms of Roman motivation, one of the things that Asia was very rich in is gold mines. So this was a potentially very lucrative business to conquer. And so we see some conflicts there, even though eventually those were abandoned by Domitian. And so at this point, not really that much happened, but Dacia will remain a source of conflict, as we will observe under future emperors. But it was back here in the German area that in the year 89, a local governor tried to have his legions name him emperor. And after this failed conspiracy, it seems that Domitian again sort of became a little bit worse of an emperor, or at least someone more paranoid. So he had a number of conflicts with senators, leading to treason trials again. So we see that sort of atmosphere of fear. Rumors circulated that Domitian maybe wanted to emphasize the autocratic aspects of his rules. So, for example, some of our sources report that maybe he wanted to be called master, even by Roman senators, which is something usually only a slave would have to use such a phrase towards an actual master, right? I think if you read Mary Beard, she describes this very scary dinner we hear stories about, in which he invited a number of senators to dinner, and everything was decorated in black, and there were these fake tombstones set up for the people who were invited, and they were like, okay, this is over, I'm just gonna get killed at the end of the dinner. Wasn't a fun dinner, I bet. And then they all go home and they get a gift, but it's sort of, I guess, funny. For the emperor, I'm not sure. It seems that things are really getting scary at this time, or those are the reports that we are getting from our sources, such as Suetonius, and then in addition to Tacitus, who also disliked Domitian. A new source that gets mentioned now sometimes is Cassius Dio, D-I-O, who is a very interesting late 2nd century source. So let's look at this little quote here from Mary Beard. The peculiarly murderous image of the Roman imperial court, where danger seems to have lurked on every fig, and such an atmosphere of suspicion prevailed, that Domitian is said to have had his palace walls lined with reflecting stone, so that he could see who was coming up behind. So I like this quote, and I choose this over all the other ones from Mary Beard, because we get a lot of bad stories about Domitian and being sort of a scary man, but I think this gives us an image of Domitian as himself scared, right? So this was a mutually scary environment across the board, and nothing, that this went sort of worked both ways. And ultimately, it led to much hatred towards Domitian, and eventually he was killed in 96, in fact, assassinated in a palace coup. And at that moment, the Senate was able to act and appoint a new emperor. So things kind of went back to a more peaceful version of government. So overall, in this lesson, we talked about the Flavian age as a sort of, this is the first dynasty after Julio-Claudians, and it's in many ways a successful one. It brings quite a bit of peace overall, and the administration of the empire seems solid. And I think that one further piece of this is sort of culture. And I wanted to show you one more image to leave you with. So when you go to a museum, as we will all go to a museum at some point again, you sometimes see these Roman female statues whose hair looks just intense, shall we say. So this is the same head. This is what it looks like from the back. Okay, that's just a bun. But here it is from the front, and here it is from the side. So we get this sort of lots of curls. This takes a lot of ironing to get it into that shape. And this was a particular hairstyle, very, very popular under the Flavians. And I wanted to show you this because I think it's interesting that sort of culture in a certain way has a particular Flavian style. It was a period that people thought of as a sort of unit. and which continued for a little bit after, but it's sort of has its own style, its own feel, just like today, there is a certain 80s haircut, that we can all laugh about. The same way this period had its sort of own culture. And I think that is to the praise of the Flavian emperors, is that they brought a period of relative peace, relative prosperity to the empire. And even if they also proved that somehow this idea of dynasties, the idea that somebody should rule just because they are the son to someone who happens to be ruling right now, or at least the adoptive son, is problematic. And so the next challenge for the Romans to solve was how to do that, how to find emperors who are actually qualified, and maybe it shouldn't matter who their father was. Is there a way to solve this problem? That's what we will find out next.